Hey, this is one of two videos I'm going to make for the UI in our project, and I'm kind of going to go through several of the widgets I've made to talk about key points of each of them and then show how they're integrated into the project. The other video will go into the development of a widget, so I'll make a simple template kind of widget that we could use later on in the sprint to make the main in-game UI. And as I was thinking about that, I'll have to do a little research on how to get that to show up in your screen space, like basically in your face versus in the world like this one is. Normally it's super easy, it's kind of the default, but with VR, I don't know how to do that because it has two lenses and it doesn't automatically work. So this in the regular first-person mode would normally just take up the whole screen. There's no like looking around, you're basically in the menu. But I've placed it on this blueprint with this yellow cube being a trigger where if the player is overlapping it, it'll show the widget or it'll change the functionality. And you can tell it exactly what you want it to do, and I think I have it set up to say, when I enter this box, change what is visible and what's not. A little bit rusty on how everything is going, but this is the blueprint for it, and there's really nothing here you can see. This is a child class of the image data, or the BP data point base. So I made one for image, for audio, for video. So this one is the image data point. The reason I had to do that is because in VR, being out in the world, I couldn't have it switch which kind it was at runtime. So some things you can say, all right, whenever I hit it, decide what to do, but because of the way the VR works, I wasn't able to do that, and I actually can't explain why real well, so I'm kind of doing a workaround. Anyway, so we'll go to the base class so we can see the functionality, and that's this one here. The different colored comments I'm using to represent different kinds of things. The yellow comment boxes I'm using for all the first-person stuff because we're not going to have that in the project. In most cases, you're almost always going to be in our typical VR pond, and otherwise you might be in that floating pond where you don't have a character that you're running around as, like in the main menu. You don't teleport around, you just look at the menu. But this is what we were using for testing, and it's not used very often. So this setup function gets the game instance. The game instance is a reference. This is kind of like including it in a class. So we're casting to it and saving the variable so that we don't have this little block every time. I'm just kind of modularizing that and just using this reference throughout. And so you'll see this at a lot of the files. I've made a little folder here for references and added that one to it. And to do that, by the way, category over here, you just say what kind you want. And so this custom settings, each of those, I made that written there. So I've got the game instance, and we'll pop over to it to see these arrays here. This box is an array, this is a single value. And you can set that up here on each variable. And this is containing, let's see, each data point has one that I will hard code right now. So the text to display is set at in the map. So when I click on this, I can go down here and do the text to display. We mentioned doing a spreadsheet to get this stuff fed into it, and this is what it looks like without doing that. I'm just copy pasting it all in there. So obviously not great, but as a demonstration it worked. What we would do otherwise is say, okay, here's my widget, and then when I come into it, I'll say get that file and fill this array. So instead of typing it in one at a time, selecting the images, the sounds, we would feed to that from a data structure of these that I'll go into in a different video. I'm probably going to jump around like crazy on this, so if it's all over the place, I'm sorry. But we're setting it up by getting the game instance and telling it, hey, this is this widget's information. And so I'm updating it in the game instance, which I will go into more in the blueprints video. But basically it knows all sorts of things about the game all the time. And now back in the game instance, whenever I'm activating that widget, it's going to talk to this as well. So this is kind of like the interface for all these different types of things. So when I walked over that widget, it says, hey, game instance, set up the widget so that each time I walk over them, they can tell them their unique traits. And I don't have to make a whole widget for each one. I just make like a template that can be customized. So I've got the different types of widgets, and this could probably all be combined into one thing. You can see that they're like almost identical, but I haven't done that yet for this project because I was making them one at a time. So this data point is right here. It is actually just going to add it to the screen. It looks like I'm customizing it later, or in the widget itself. So it was saying, hey, load this thing. This is going to say, is this widget already here? And if not, I'm going to create it. That way, every time I walk over a box, it doesn't make a whole new widget, and I just have a pile of them in the background taking memory. If I do already have one, we're just going to add it to the viewport. If I don't, I make it and add it to the viewport. And this separate logic is just whenever I add it, play a little sound, like the widget popped up and it makes a little blip. And that sound is something that is being set custom as well. So this sound play is coming in from the widget, which is calling this function. So going back to that, setup widget. It's not the right one. Maybe that was first person stuff. Well, if I'm not doing that, that's something we can do. Like sprite to display, images to display, it would be sound to play. And it would just say, hey, game instance, this is the variable for that. The way that we get these things to be populated from the map is that these little eyeballs are saying that it's instance editable. If they're not checked like this, then it's just whatever I have set up in here. If they're checked, then whenever I come over here, there will be options down here. And you can see custom settings. That was that category I set up. So it just makes this thing more organized. Otherwise, it would just be like one long list of stuff. And you can see that this is what the engine had set up, and that's how they have it set up as well. They have a category for active, they have a category for input. I made a category for custom settings. And that's kind of like a designer way of the developer setting up the engine to be a little bit customized for this specific product. So every time I place one of these things, if I duplicate it, now I've got two of them. To duplicate, by the way, you hold down Alt while you click and drag. And that works, yeah, if you're in the moving around mode. So you see these arrows, I'm moving it around. If I press W, it takes me to that. If I press E, it takes me to the rotate. If I press R, it takes me to the scale. And this one probably, it does certain things you can see scale. But you can scale on each axis individually or all together. And that's the same for rotating, or not rotating, movement and scale. So you can move in multiple axes at once. Anyway, we'll get rid of this one in a second, but if I put 10 of these in here and I wanted them all to be different, I would just say, all right, we'll play this sound, play that sound. These are the widget to load. It's not something for VR. Sprite to display is what is this little doodad there. I haven't switched them out yet, but I think Eric made the little icons for different types of widgets, or at least one of them. Anyway, that's how you set up the custom things, and it knows about them inside the blueprint, and then it tells the game instance, which kind of is like the brain of everything. So we'll get rid of this one now. But you see all these options here. You've got all these different things to select, and you know, where are they? Most of these are just engine content. It comes with it whenever you set it up. You can take it out of there, especially when we package it, so that it doesn't load all this into the file for no reason. And I think some of that might be automatically done to optimize it. It's like saying, hey, this texture was never used, so we're not going to include it in the build. But the ones that we added, like I added all these sounds, are just throughout here. And If we go to the VR, we have a sounds folder, and it's got all of those there. So that's how the directory is set up, where it's getting a little bit overlappy, like the textures is kind of like a broad thing. Like I have that map icon image that I've been using for some of the scene transitions, and it's mixed with all these normal maps and things, which obviously doesn't make sense. We would maybe want to have like an icons folder or a thumbnails folder, but that's the idea. You have sounds and images and audio and stuff. Well, sounds or audio. So let's go into the blueprint, and I have several of them open to show different kinds of things. This was the video blueprint, which is a lot like this image one, but instead of the image box, it's got a video box. So you can see some of the stuff is overlapping. This red box is something that doesn't get displayed all the time. And the way that is set is, here's our details. Like if I didn't want to show this box, visibility in it, like this one is set to hidden by default. If you remember from the demonstrations, when you walk up to it, there's nothing there. When you get close, it pulls it up. Or it lets you hit a button and pull it up, or whatever the functionality is. So I'll go into this more when I'm doing the video about making it, but when you put these elements in here, you can just say, like, I want a text box. I just drag it in, and there it popped up into the corner. And if I wanted this text box in a certain spot, clicking this. Well, let's just pretend it was this one that I wanted to move. Like if this was up in the corner, these anchors let you move it in a snapped way. Like right now, I can just place this anywhere. But if someone is on a different size screen, it may not show up right. You can see how my content in the center there is getting is staying in the same position all the time, but my other one is kind of changing and it's a little funky. And that is the anchors, which is up here. So this element I had anchored before in the center. And you don't just click it like that, because that'll only set up part of the anchors. Like hold shift to update the alignment, control to update position. And I don't know if alt does anything, because I think there's a third thing, but I just hold control, shift, alt, and I click that, and it sets all of that at once. So now it's dead in the center, and if I wanted to have it a little bit higher, this is a 0 to 1 scale, if you remember from like, I think it was linear algebra. Anyway, it's like, it's set dead in the center, and it goes from 0, or I guess 1 is up top here. It goes from 0 to 1. So you would just drag it up wherever you want it to show up, and it's still anchored to the center, and now I just have an offset. And I was just holding it and dragging it around. I can reset those values with these little arrows, show that it's not the default, and it looks like I cleared the anchor as well. So I'll reset that. Oh, right, same center. Okay, I'll set it back up to where I wanted it. Another little editor trick is when you compile, it normally doesn't save all this stuff. You can see the little asterisk that wasn't saved. This one saved it when I hit compile, and this is just to not have to click here every time. But if I drop down this caret, there's save on compile, on success only. That's one of the things that I keep pushing to dev that gets overridden because it's in the saved folder, so we keep taking that out, I think. But it's editor preferences, and that just gives you one less click 1,000 times, and it adds up. So that's the visual thing here, and when I make one, I'll kind of explain things more. But if I move around, you can see as it's highlighted the different pieces of it. Certain things can only have one item. Is this the text block? Okay. Like I wrapped these buttons here that are highlighted in a vertical box and then a horizontal box. So if I wanted to have 2 rows of buttons, I would have this vertical box and have a second element in here, and it would drop it down right below. I've got this thing sized to content. Like see right here, here's the actual size of the box. This size to content fills up whatever I have in there. The horizontal box I have inside of that is dividing these buttons up in between. These things are how it's justified, like like any text editor, you can understand how it would left or right justify it or fill, just like a word. And it does that horizontally and vertically. Auto and fill will make these buttons either spaced out evenly, or if I wanted only this one to fill, it would smash these down to the side where they are only as big as their content, because I think I have that selected as well. So it would stick them down to their side, and then this guy would fill up as much as it could within the horizontal box. So you just have like a hierarchy of wrappers basically. Inside of my vertical box I have this and that content. Inside my horizontal box, inside of the vertical box, I have such and such content. And there's more advanced things you can do with switching things. Like this same vertical box could have 5 different types of things. And you would have like a widget switcher, which I would say, if I'm player 1, show the widget switcher version 1. If I'm player 2, version 2. Or if I'm dead, switch to the dead buttons or whatever. And logic would say what you display where. And then back to how you show specific things. That was the video data point. Here I am in the image data point. And let me get to one that actually updates it dynamically. I have one open that I made a function for. Here we go. Get current scene selection text. So that comes into play with, I think, select this scene. Well, what I'm looking for is, here it is. So this text, this text is bound to that function, and this next scene is just hard-coded. It's I just typed in next scene right here. If I wanted that to be dynamic, I would bind it to a function. I don't want it to be the same as this one, but I can make its own binding. If I click that, it'll automatically generate a function right here. And I think it's generically named, but you can have to or rename it that way. So I am in the function up here. You can see our default event graph. Everything has its own graph like this. This is pretty much all you'll normally see unless you create custom functions. You can make entirely separate graphs. Like if you start this all wild and woolly, you can make a separate graph so that you can show everything on one page and say, okay, this is my, well, I never really do this, so I don't know if we should bother, but like this is my main code graph, and then here's my multiplayer code graph. You could divide it up as however you want right there with the graphs. But I pretty much always only use the event graph. And then it creates graphs for functions. So this one was generated from this thing wanting to be dynamic. Select this scene when we're playing. As I go left to right, we'll show the name of the level that we would be loading. So that function here, again, is talking to the game instance, which is like the brain of the whole thing. I made this reference back here in the event graph. It just looks exactly like before. It's just the same 3 nodes that you'll see 1,000 times in the project. Event construct is like when this thing is getting created, and making that reference. I'm using it here, and this is just a structure that I made in the game instance so that I could get it wherever I want. And if the player wanted to access this, if every single widget wants to access this, I just grab a reference to the game instance, and it's like basically like including this thing in my class, and it's public. And I'm going to take the scene that I'm going to go to, which was a variable that I made in the structure, and it's of the type name. And that is what is going into this return node, and it converts it from name to a text. And so at different points of the game, like if I load up the transition scene, it's going to say, hey, the next level is going to be this. And in that logic, I'm going to say, hey, game instance, grab that struct, and then set this value. And so the next time this thing gets called, it'll have that updated. And that's kind of this blueprint communication. It's kind of like everything talks to the brain to get the next thing set up. And that's just this little bar that gets put on the transition screen. It gets loaded into the world. The same way that here I've loaded this into that, the transition screen has a little blueprint simpler than this that only loads that little bit. Now the scene transition is this one here, and all of this data is getting updated, but not all the time. Like this function it's getting called not on tick, but very often. So it's probably not the right application for it. But like if your health was often increased or decreased, then you would want to know immediately. And so it would say, hey, what's the health? What's the health? What's the health on some kind of like rate of like 5 times a second, or maybe even on tick, which is 60 times or whatever times a second. Anyway, this is updated only when I explicitly tell it to, and I do that by going to the game instance again. So the reference will be created up above, and then this is a function in the game instance the same way that this guy was a function in this one. Like, it's kind of obvious, but at the same time, since it's all visual, it's hard to say. It's hard to like translate it to our regular coding. Like to see this as a function that we would write in a C file is kind of hard for me, at least, to translate, because all of these nodes are as well, but you use them like Legos, whereas this thing was handwritten in another blueprint. So I made a custom event here. You do that by right-clicking, add custom event, and the difference between custom events and functions is a little bit nuanced and beyond what I can just rattle off about. But basically, when something happens, it calls an event. And then whenever you're doing stuff within all these files, if you do things often, and just kind of like helper functions in a file that we might write, is the kind of time that you would write a function versus an event. There are other things that have to do with whether it's, I think, asynchronous or whether it waits for it to finish. Like if you're in a custom event, I think it all just happens in the background, where a function will have to go to completion before. I think I have this backwards. The function will just get called and forgotten, whereas the custom event has to finish. So if I am in here, I can do delays. Like I can say, hey, show all this data, and then delay a second, and then hide all this data for whatever reason. Like if the boss is coming, you want to flash a warning screen. I can put delays in here, whereas with the function I can't, because the function is just like, all right, just fire that off, and any delays would just be like, okay, there's a delay, but it doesn't stop to do them. So here I'm setting up the scene transition, which is how I have. I guess I was already there. It's how I have this default info here that I just typed in, and custom information for each scene. So whenever I'm transitioning between levels in the game, it'll say, hey, game instance, I'm going to a new level, here's the new information. And then now that I'm here in the widget, I'm like, hey, game instance, what was that current information? And that happens whenever this thing gets plopped up on the screen. It's like, all right, we're going to the transition, let's set it up this time. And it's just set it up once and it's done. Whereas that text over here was like, what's the current one? What's the current one all the time? So I think that's kind of it for this. It's basically the difference between something that will always show static, like these buttons are always going to say previous scene, next scene. But then to select this scene, I want it to be dynamic, and I want to know, apparently, I want to know all the time what it's going to be. And then over here, it's like, well, this is only going to change once, so I'm just going to set it whenever I create the thing. And this setup scene transition isn't automatic. It's not just like because it's here, it happens. So somewhere else I'm calling it, and I think that is on the blueprint itself, but I'll have to take a look. So that is most of what I wanted to show. But there was one more thing here. This open next scene is just one button, one element that goes into the game instance, grabs the next level, which is from that struct, I believe, and then calls this open level function. And it's going to be set up. Next level will get updated wherever I'm running around. It's like if I'm in a menu and I say, hey, next I want to go to the launch key event, it's going to say update the next level in the game instance to that. Anyway, this thing doesn't know that. It just says when I click a button, do whatever. That would be like this button here. You can see it highlighted. If you scroll down, we'll have events. On clicked, I would either be adding events like this. Like when I hover over a button, it can change the text. Like open next scene, it's like you hover over it and it changes the text to whatever. But then on clicked, I created this thing, and that knows a mouse click, and then separately we've told it to know the VR triggers. So this thing doesn't care how it's clicked, it just just says if this is clicked, do this thing. The point of this is that there's only one little thing here, and I'm never adding this widget to the world. I'm adding this widget to whatever basically containing widget it needed to be in, which I don't know at the top of my head, but it could be this one, and I would just say here, user widget. There is okay. So user created. I could have just searched for that thing. So open next scene. That might be it. But if I have a widget that I've made separately, I can just add it to this. I'll just drag the widget in, and see it. The button is showing up wherever this thing is all divided up into those horizontal and vertical boxes. You can see, so it doesn't just let me put it wherever I want. And I can't put it in the background because I guess this is the whole screen. So this is just the background. But that's how you add a whole widget to another widget. Widgetception. This is probably way too long, but I'm going to make a separate video next that goes into creating a simple widget. So let me know how these are, what kinds of things I should skip over or take more time on. And if you like more general videos that go into not a specific item like a UI, but how nodes and things work, or how editor elements work, that kind of thing.